Hi, welcome to Sunday Storytime, the online program where I read children's stories to adults who often act like children on social media, and mostly not in a good way. Cheers. So, I'm excited today. We're on chapter 3 of the trophy chapter book Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown, illustrated by Steve Bjorkman. Now, for those of you who aren't with us and you just don't feel like watching the rest of the videos to get up to speed, chapter 1, we found out a couple of things. We found out that the family in this book's actual last name is Lamb Chop. Then we found out that they don't like people yelling in the house. They're really particular about that kind of language. Don't say hey because that's for horses kind of people. And we also found out that, surprise, 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 these people think that a bulletin board for Christmas is a really super neato idea. Until that super neato bulletin board falls off the wall in the middle of the night and squishes their older son Stanley. And then the next morning when the younger son comes in to tell him about it, he gets scolded for being loud because his brother's laying in bed flat. And then they took him to the doctor, and the doctor said he was flat. And then the next week, not only did we found out a couple of things. We found out that Stanley is the kind of kid that keeps an extra spare pair of shoestrings in his pocket. And lucky he did, because they tied him together and tied it onto his belt buckle and dangled him down through the grates of a sewer. And he went down in the sewer and found his mom's ring that she had lost in there. And while they were doing that, the cops came and looked at Mom, and everything was cool. They got the ring. Stanley came out, but the cops called her a cuckoo, and she got offended. She kind of threw a hissy fit, Mom Lamb Chop did. She kind of threw a hissy fit. This Mrs. Lamb Chop is kind of a spitfire. I like her. But now we're going into chapter 3, Stanley the Kite. Now, I want you to notice now, Arthur is Stanley's younger brother, and there's a picture of them going to the park, and you can tell that Stanley's being carried like that. And look at the younger brother, Arthur. A little bit of attitude there, right there. See that? Just a little bit of attitude on that face. I'm looking to see what kind of happens. Does this sibling rivalry erupt into bad brother stuff? What happens in chapter 3, Stanley the Kite? Mr. Lamb Chop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lamb Chop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. I imagine it would be. Mr. Lamb Chop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him. Roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for his hand. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he'd never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. See, we're getting somewhere now. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lamb Chop's. "Well, George, I see you must have bought some wallpaper," said Mr. Jones. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lamb Chop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," said Mr. Jones. "George," he said to Mr. Lamb Chop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lamb Chop said. "Stanley is a third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lamb Chop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." See, I told you they don't like rudeness. Arthur could only blush and apologize. Mr. Lamb Chop rolled Stanley back up again, and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges. But Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his big brother after all." Big brothers. The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days." Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. "You can fly me, Arthur," he said. "Come on." He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze, and up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted to speed. He only had to turn his thin edge to the wind carefully a little at a time so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down towards the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody has ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running around with an empty spool. But Stanley went right on, though, showing off. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in the fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until the leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak. There he is. He's in the tree. See, and the kids are climbing up to get him. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, he was still cross. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day having fun," she said. "You don't realize what I go through with these boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." Well, next week's chapter is not where will we find the body of Mr. Lambchop, but it's entitled The Museum of Thieves. The Museum of Thieves is chapter 4. That's coming up next week. Thanks for joining us here at Sunday Story Time. Have a nice day.